Comrade Natalie, the organization needs you and Commander Austin to temporarily divorce. In her past life, when she heard these words, she had cried her eyes out, kneeling down to beg them not to tear her family apart. In this life, she simply picked up the pen and smiled. Okay, I'll sign. The expressions on everyone present shattered in disbelief. But they didn't know that in her past life, she had guarded that cold, empty house for 30 years in Julian's place, waiting until her hair turned white and her tears ran dry, only to die all alone in a freezing room at the military family compound. In this life, whoever wanted to be the commander's wife could have the title. She, Natalie, would live for herself. Welcome back, Tiny Diary YT. Imagine sacrificing your dreams for a loveless marriage. Today's lead did just that, burying her medical genius for 30 years. But given a second chance on her divorce day, she doesn't cry. She simply signs the papers, reclaims her scalpel, and chooses herself. Let's dive in. She opened her eyes on a hospital bed, or more accurately, in a ward at the Military General Hospital. The pungent smell of disinfectant rushed up her nose. The incandescent light bulb on the ceiling was so bright that it made her eyes blur. She stared blankly for 3 seconds, because she was all too familiar with this ceiling, this smell, and this bed. In her past life, she had stayed in this hospital countless times. The first time was for a miscarriage, the second time for a stomach hemorrhage, and the third time for a relapse of her heart condition. Every single time, the chair beside her bed had been completely empty. Julian had never come to visit her once, not even a single time. "Natalie, are you awake?" A woman in a gray-green military uniform asked as she pushed the door open and walked in. She was Commissar Hall, the deputy director of the military political department, and Natalie knew her well. In her past life, it was this very woman who had brought the divorce agreement to her. It was the winter of 1978. Natalie glanced at the calendar on the nightstand. December 16, 1978. Her hands clenched the corner of the blanket tightly. She had truly returned to the past. Commissar Hall sat down beside the bed with a very awkward expression. She took a stack of papers out of her briefcase and placed them in front of Natalie. Natalie looked down and read, "Divorce Agreement. Party A, Julian Austin. Party B, Natalie." Commissar Hall weighed her words carefully. "Natalie, the organization has considered this matter very thoroughly. Commander Austin is about to be deployed to the border for a special long-term mission involving high-level state secrets. From an organizational safety perspective, we believe that temporarily ending your marital relationship will be best for both parties." In her past life, when Natalie heard this, her entire body had trembled. She had grabbed Commissar Hall's hand and asked if she had done something wrong, or if Julian didn't want her anymore. She had cried so hard she could barely breathe, kneeling on the ground to beg the woman, saying she could wait no matter how long it took. In the end, she didn't sign it. But what of it? Julian still left. Once he left, he was gone for 30 years. For those 30 years, she took his place in fulfilling filial duties to his parents and supporting the entire family. His mother, Valerie, despised her humble background and constantly insulted her as a country bumpkin. His younger sister, Samantha, would come to the house every few weeks to take things away. The meat in the refrigerator, the fabric coupons in the cabinet, and the industrial coupons she had saved up for 6 months. After taking everything, Samantha would still criticize her for being stingy. Natalie had endured it all because she thought everything would get better once Julian returned. But did he ever really come back? He did, taking a total of 7 days of home leave. During those 7 days, he stayed at home for 2 days and spent the other 5 days with his military unit. Even during the 2 days he was at home, he barely said a few words to her. At night, he slept with his back turned to her, his breathing steady and even. She would stare at his back, wanting to tell him about all the grievances she had suffered over the years. But though she opened her mouth several times, she could never utter a single word. She was afraid that he would find her annoying, afraid that he would think she wasn't strong enough, and afraid that she wasn't worthy of being a soldier's wife. Later, he left again. After that, he was promoted to commander. And after that, she heard that he had a young, beautiful female staff officer named Stephanie by his side, who frequently appeared with him at various events. By then, Natalie was over 50 years old, her hair was streaked with gray, and her back was no longer straight. She didn't make a scene. She didn't dare to. She just sat alone in the courtyard, looking at the pomegranate tree they had planted the year they got married, remembering what he had told her all those years ago. "Natalie, wait until I finish fighting the war and return. I will take you to see the ocean." He had never taken her to see the ocean. The day she died was a beautiful, sunny day. Her neighbor, Chloe, had found her collapsed in the kitchen, still clutching half an unpeeled potato in her hand. By the time she was taken to the hospital, it was too late. It was a brain hemorrhage. She heard that upon receiving the news, Julian Austin had remained silent for a long time. She heard he had stood at her funeral for a very long time. She even heard he had said a single sentence. "I owe her." But so what? When a person was already dead, anything said was simply too late. Therefore, in this life, when Commissar Hall placed the divorce agreement in front of her, Natalie did not cry, did not beg, and did not utter a single unnecessary word. She sat up and took the fountain pen from the woman's hand. Commissar Hall froze. "Natalie, don't rush. You can take your time to think about this." "There's no need to think." Natalie opened the agreement, flipped to the last page, and signed her name in the space for Party B. Commissar Hall's mouth opened and closed. Clearly, she had not expected this outcome. Are you sure?" Natalie handed the pen back to her and smiled. "I'm sure." Commissar Hall stared at the signature for a long time, her expression shifting several times. Perhaps she thought Natalie would act like she did in her past life, crying loudly, making a scene, and refusing to agree even if her life depended on it. After all, in everyone's eyes, Natalie's greatest value was being Julian Austin's wife. Divorced, she would be nothing. But they didn't know the truth. Before marrying Julian in her past life, Natalie had been the top student in the surgical department at the State Medical Academy. Her advisor, Professor Thomas Harding, was a leading national expert in cardiovascular surgery. He had said she was the most gifted student he had ever met, and that she would undoubtedly become a top-tier surgeon in the future. But for Julian, she had given up everything, dropping out of school to get married, following the military, and turning herself into a mere dependent. In this life, she would not make that mistake again. Commissar Hall put away the signed agreement and stood up. Before leaving, she turned her head to look at Natalie one last time. "Natalie, even though you've signed it, try not to be too heartbroken. The organization will take care of you." "Thank you, Commissar Hall, but there's no need." Natalie threw off the blanket, got out of bed, put on her cotton slippers, and walked over to the window. Outside stood the sycamore trees of the military compound, their bare branches swaying in the winter wind. In her past life, she had looked at these rows of trees and waited for 30 long years. In this life, she was going to walk right out of this compound. Less than half an hour after Commissar Hall left, the door was pushed open again. Natalie knew the new arrival well, too. It was Valerie, Julian's mother, her former mother-in-law. She was wearing a dark blue padded jacket, her hair combed neatly without a single strand out of place. Her expression was hard to read. It was unclear whether she was happy or simply disdainful. But Natalie knew Valerie was happy because the woman had never liked her. "I heard you signed it," Valerie said, sitting down in a chair and crossing her legs. "That was more decisive than I expected." Natalie said nothing. "That's good too." Valerie took a folded piece of paper from her pocket, unfolded it, and placed it on the table. "Since you're divorced, there are a few things we need to make clear." Natalie glanced at the paper. It was a list. The house in the military family compound belonged to the Austin family. The household savings of $320 belonged to the Austin family. The sewing machine, the bicycle, and the radio, the 3 big-ticket items, belonged to the Austin family. Even the pair of mahogany chests, which had been Natalie's dowry when she got married, belonged to the Austin family. Finally, there was an added line. Natalie's personal belongings are to be taken away by her. After finishing reading, Natalie looked up at her. Valerie put on a patronizing air. "I'm not trying to bully you. You can take your clothes and your books. As for everything else in the house, don't even think about it. It was all bought using Julian's allowance." In her past life, Natalie had never seen this list. Because in her past life, she hadn't signed the divorce papers. She had continued to live in that house, even though it had never held an ounce of warmth. But if she had signed it back then, Valerie probably would have pulled out this exact same list. If it were the Natalie of her past life, she definitely would have cried and argued. "When we got married, we had nothing. I saved up to buy the sewing machine myself, and half of the savings in the bank came from my salary. But in this life, all right." Natalie nodded. Valerie was stunned. She seemed not to have expected Natalie to be so compliant. You agree?" "Yeah, you're absolutely right." Natalie walked over to the bed. She opened her canvas bag. Inside were a few sets of clothes she had brought to change into when she was admitted to the hospital. She folded each item and put it in the bag. She didn't need any of those things anymore, nor did she need the house. She picked up the canvas bag and walked toward the door. As she passed Valerie, she stopped. "Comrade Valerie, there is something I have held back for a very long time." She looked straight into her eyes. "What your son owes me, he won't be able to repay in this lifetime." Valerie's expression changed instantly. What do you mean? You're divorced, and you still want to cling to our Austen family? Natalie chuckled softly, didn't answer, and pushed the door open to step outside. At the end of the hallway, she ran into a tall, beautiful woman wearing a well-fitted military uniform with a second lieutenant's insignia on the collar. It was Stephanie, the female staff officer beside Julian in the rumors from her past life. In this life, she finally got a clear look at her face at this moment. She stood in the middle of the hallway, holding a bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums. Her expression was very strange, no, very complex. Are you, Natalie? Her voice was soft, carrying a deliberate fragility. I heard you weren't feeling well and were hospitalized, so I came to visit you. Yellow chrysanthemums? Visiting a patient and giving yellow chrysanthemums? Were these flowers meant for the sick? Natalie looked at the bouquet in Stephanie's hands, then at the carefully painted expression of concern on her face. In her past life, she hadn't known Stephanie. By the time she learned her name, Natalie was over 50 years old. Back then, someone told her that Stephanie had come to Julian's side as a staff officer at the age of 18, following him from the regiment all the way to the military region command. Her father was Julian's former superior. So that was it. Her capabilities and age were much more suitable than hers. Natalie had once thought that the so-called organizational arrangement for the divorce was truly just for work requirements. But before she died in her past life, in the hospital corridor, she had vaguely heard Samantha on the phone with someone. Wasn't the divorce back then pushed by Stephanie behind the scenes? She had someone submit the report to the higher-ups, and my mother also lent a helping hand. She hadn't heard everything because she was dying at the time, but she remembered. She remembered it very clearly. Therefore, standing in the hallway at this moment, looking at the young, beautiful woman in front of her, and seeing the fleeting smugness in the depths of her eyes, Natalie felt no hatred in her heart. She only felt a bone-chilling cold. Thank you for the flowers. She reached out to accept the yellow chrysanthemums, turned around, walked a few steps, and tossed them into the trash can at the end of the hallway. Sorry, I don't like chrysanthemums. Stephanie's expression instantly became incredibly colorful. The smile at the corners of her lips stiffened, and the mask of fragility in her eyes cracked, but she quickly recovered her smile. Natalie, it's normal that you're in a bad mood. After all, divorce is truly too cruel for a woman. Her voice carried just the right amount of pity. If you need any help in the future, just come find me. Although I'm just a staff officer by Commander Austen's side, I can still put in a good word or two. Natalie understood. She heard every single word clearly. This was a show of dominance, a gentle, dignified show of dominance that made it impossible for anyone to find fault with. There's no need. Natalie picked up her canvas bag and walked past her. From today onwards, Commander Austen has nothing to do with me anymore. She didn't turn her head, but she knew Stephanie was definitely smiling behind her. Stephanie thought she had won, but she didn't know that in this game, the loser wasn't Natalie. When she stepped out of the military hospital gates, the north wind lashed directly against her face. December in the north was so cold it could crack a person's bones. She wore a thin padded jacket, carrying a canvas bag. Inside the bag, she only had $7.30, along with a pass to the military family compound. She probably wouldn't need to use that pass anymore either. She stood in front of the hospital gates for a moment, taking a deep breath of the freezing air. Her lungs felt as if they were filled with crushed ice, painful, but keeping her wide awake. The 30 years of her past life flashed rapidly through her mind. The endless piles of laundry, the never-ending meals to cook, the countless scowls from her mother-in-law, and the New Year's Eves she had forced herself to endure all alone. It was over. It was all in the past now. In this life, she had to go find someone, Professor Thomas Harding, her mentor. In her past life, after she dropped out of school, he was absolutely heartbroken and had written 3 letters advising her to return and continue her studies. She hadn't answered any of his letters because Valerie had told her, what use is it for a woman to study so much? Staying home and serving your husband well is the proper thing to do. And she had actually believed it. In this life, she absolutely would not believe it anymore. Pulling her padded jacket tighter around herself, Natalie walked toward the bus station. The State Medical Academy was located in the state capital, over 300 kilometers away. Taking a long-distance bus would take 6 hours. $7.30 was just enough to buy a one-way ticket. That was enough. She only needed to make this journey once. The long-distance bus bumped along the highway for 6 full hours. By the time it arrived in the capital, it was already dark. She stood in front of the bus station, her breath turning into white mist in the freezing air. In her pocket, she only had $1.80 left. The State Medical Academy was located on the west side of the city, a 40-minute walk away. Without hesitation, she started walking. As she passed a pan-fried bun stall, her stomach gave a loud rumble. She clutched the money in her pocket tightly and kept walking. It wasn't that she wasn't hungry, but she needed this $1.80 for something else. 40 minutes later, she stood in front of the gates of the State Medical Academy. Through the iron gate, supported by two concrete pillars, a wooden sign hung above reading, State Medical Academy. It had been 5 years. She had left this place exactly 5 years ago. The light in the security guard's booth was still on. She knocked on the window. "Excuse me, could you tell me where Professor Thomas Harding's office is?" The elderly guard, wearing reading glasses, looked her up and down. "You're looking for Professor Harding? He got off work a long time ago. Come back tomorrow." "Then where is he right now?" "I can't tell you where he is. Who are you to him?" She thought for a moment. "I'm his student, Natalie." The old man pushed up his glasses and suddenly froze. "You're Natalie? That student of Professor Harding's?" There was a strange hint of astonishment in his voice. "Wait a minute, let me make a call." He turned around, dialed a number and spoke a few words into the receiver. After hanging up, he looked at her and shook his head. "Professor Harding said you should go to his house. Faculty Housing, Building 3, Apartment 401. He paused for a moment before adding, "Young lady, Professor Harding has been waiting for you for a very long time." Her nose immediately stung with unshed tears. The door to Professor Harding's house was unlocked. Standing in the doorway, she saw the warm light inside and a slightly hunched silhouette. He had grown old. 5 years ago, he was still a vigorous, energetic, middle-aged man. Now his hair was completely white, and his back was stooped. He was sitting at his desk, an old textbook open in front of him. Hearing the sound at the door, he turned his head. The moment he saw her, his eyes turned red. "This student of mine has finally remembered me," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Natalie walked in, set down her canvas bag, stood in front of him, and bowed deeply. "Professor Harding, I'm back. I want to continue my studies. I want to be a surgeon." Thomas Harding looked at her for a long time without speaking. Finally, he slammed his hand down on the desk. "You should have come back a long time ago." He stood up, rummaged through a cabinet, pulled out a set of medical textbooks, and stacked them heavily in front of her. "Starting tomorrow, you will shadow me during the day to see patients. At night, you will study on your own to make up for the knowledge you missed. 5 years have passed, but your foundation is still there. I am giving you half a year." He held up a single finger. "Within half a year, you must pass all the makeup exams. Can you do it?" She looked at the thick stack of books without a hint of fear. In her past life, she had lost 30 years. In this life, half a year was more than enough. "I can do it." That night, she slept in Professor Harding's living room. The blanket was very thin, but she didn't feel cold at all because a fire was burning in her heart. That was her first night after being reborn, and it was also the beginning of the very first time in this life she was living for herself. For the next half year, she studied like a madwoman. During the day, she shadowed Professor Harding at the outpatient clinic, did ward rounds, and observed surgeries. At night, she returned to her dorm to devour textbooks, take notes, and practice suturing. Professor Harding had found an empty student dorm room for her and helped her with the paperwork to audit classes. There were people gossiping at the school. "Isn't that Natalie? Didn't she marry some high-ranking officer? Why is she back? I heard she got divorced. She probably got dumped by that officer, right?" She heard them, but she paid them no mind. In her past life, words like these would have made her hide in her blanket and cry all night. In this life, those words weren't even qualified to make her furrow her brow. She only cared about one thing. Could her hands still hold a scalpel steady? 3 months later, Professor Harding allowed her onto the operating table to assist for the first time. It was an appendectomy, the most basic surgical procedure. He stood at the position of the primary surgeon, and she stood opposite him. When he handed her the hemostat, her hand was unusually steady. She hadn't touched surgical instruments in 5 years, but the feeling was still there. Muscle memory remained. Furthermore, during the 30 years of her past life, even though she couldn't perform surgeries, she had never stopped reading. Julian hadn't known about the things he had never cared to notice: the medical journals under her pillow, the anatomical notes in her drawer, the surgical incision diagrams she drew under the desk lamp late at night. It was all real. She had never given up. It was just that no one had ever given her a chance. After the surgery ended, Professor Harding stood in front of the scrub sink and looked at her. "Natalie, do you know why I was always waiting for you to come back?" She shook her head. Because your hands are the most suitable hands for holding a scalpel that I have ever seen. He turned off the faucet and said seriously, the length of your fingers, your flexibility, and your stability are 1 in 100. In the surgical profession, talent accounts for 30%, hard work accounts for 30%, and the remaining 40% is mindset. You have all three. He sighed. When you dropped out that year, I was furious for a whole year. Professor Herte, I'm sorry. Don't say sorry, he waved his hand. You've come back, and that is enough. Half a year later, she passed all the makeup exams. On her transcript, surgery was a 98, anatomy was a 96, and pathology was a 97, ranking first in the entire department. When the news spread, no one gossiped about her divorce anymore. Instead, they started talking about something else. The State Medical Academy had produced a bizarre genius who, after taking a 5-year hiatus, returned for half a year and scored at the top of the department. But she didn't care about those things. What she cared about was that in August 1979, the First State General Hospital posted a recruitment notice. The surgery department was hiring 2 resident doctors. The number of applicants across the state was 147, and she was one of them. On the day of the exam, the testing room was set up in the tiered lecture hall of the state hospital. She sat in the 3rd row and opened the test paper. She finished the written exam in an hour and a half. The practical exam involved performing a cholecystectomy on a pig model. When she stepped up to the operating table, someone in the judge's row whispered, "This girl is too young, huh? She doesn't look like she has any experience." She paid it no mind, put on her gloves, and picked up the scalpel. 26 minutes. A complete gallbladder removal. Blood loss was controlled to under 30 milliliters. The sutures were perfectly even, without a single wasted stitch. The panel of judges fell completely silent. 3 days later, the list of accepted candidates was announced. Her name was at the very top. The night she received the acceptance notice, she sat alone on the windowsill of her dorm room, looking out at the city's night view. In the distance, a few scattered lights looked like gold flakes sprinkled over a black cloth. Suddenly, she remembered herself in her past life, 50 years old, sitting in the courtyard of the military compound, looking at the stars overhead. In her hands, she had been knitting a sweater that never seemed to get finished. That sweater was knitted for Julian. He had never worn it. She pulled her gaze back and took a deep breath. Natalie, you finally made it out. After starting work at the First State General Hospital, she began from the lowest position as a resident doctor. Night shifts, writing medical records, managing hospital beds, observing surgeries. The other residents constantly complained about the hardship and exhaustion, but she never uttered a single word. Having endured 30 years of suffering in her past life, what hadn't she experienced? What was this little bit of fatigue in comparison? Her department director was named Luke Henderson, a surgeon in his 50s with a fiery temper who never held back when scolding people. On her first day of ward rounds, he threw her medical charts back at her 3 times. "What did you write here? Rewrite it. The main symptoms are unclear, and the history of present illness is a mess. Are you here to be a doctor, or are you here to write a novel, Natalie? If you bring this level of work tomorrow, don't bother coming in." That night, Natalie worked overtime until 3 in the morning, rewriting 12 medical records. When she submitted them the next day, Director Henderson looked through them and said nothing. On the 3rd day during ward rounds, he took out her medical records and spoke in front of the entire department. "Look at the medical records Natalie wrote. This is what you call a medical record. The rest of you have studied for 4 or 5 years, yet you can't even compare to what she corrected in a single night." The office was silent for a second. Then, everyone looked at her. Some were astonished, some were unconvinced, and some were envious. She lowered her head, pretending to organize her documents. 3 months later, she performed her first independent surgery as the primary surgeon. It was an emergency case. A car accident, a ruptured spleen, and severe blood loss. When the patient was brought in, his blood pressure had dropped to 60/40. He was barely holding on. Director Henderson wasn't present that day. Another attending physician who was on duty was hesitating, unable to make a decision. She stood at the door of the operating room, looking at the numbers jumping on the monitor. "Let me do it." The attending physician stared at her. "You're just a resident. What are you going to do?" "I used to assist Professor Thomas Harding with splenectomies. I know the entire procedure by heart. I can do it." "You're crazy. He can't wait any longer. If we wait another 10 minutes, he'll be gone." The attending physician looked at the monitor, then at her, and gritted his teeth. "You do it. If anything goes wrong, I'll take the responsibility." Natalie didn't say another word. She turned around, went into the operating room, scrubbed in, put on her gown, and gloved up. From the abdominal incision to finding the bleeding point, it took her 4 minutes. Ligating the splenic artery, removing the spleen, washing the abdominal cavity, and closing it layer by layer. The surgery lasted for 1 hour and 8 minutes. When the patient was wheeled out of the operating room, his blood pressure had risen back to 110/70. Out in the hallway, the patient's family rushed over and knelt on the ground. "Doctor, thank you. Thank you for saving his life." She took off her mask, her hands still trembling slightly. It wasn't out of fear. It was a normal reaction after the adrenaline faded. The next day, the news spread throughout the First State General Hospital. Director Henderson specifically called her into his office. "Natalie?" "Director." He looked at her, his eyes carrying something she couldn't immediately decipher. "Do you know? I've been a surgeon for 30 years. The first time I performed an independent surgery as the primary surgeon, my hands shook so much that I almost dropped the hemostat into the patient's abdomen." He fell silent for a moment. "You are better than me." Coming from a hot-tempered surgeon like him, this sentence carried immense weight. She wasn't modest, because she knew she deserved those words. All right, having said all this, it's time to mention Julian, who was thousands of miles away. In her past life, after he left, he had practically forgotten about her. It was the same in this life. Or, more accurately, he had never cared about this marriage in the first place. The day she signed the papers, he was at the northwest border. Commissar Hall sent the signed agreement to his unit. She heard that when Julian received the agreement, he merely glanced at it and tossed it into a drawer without any reaction. He didn't even make a single phone call to her. It was true. In his heart, Natalie had never been important. She was merely a gentle girl he had been introduced to. They met when he was 23 and got married simply because it was time to get married. Otherwise, the looks from his comrades wouldn't be favorable. As for whether he loved her or not, perhaps he had never even thought about it. But Stephanie did. She had thought about it for a very long time. She was 5 years younger than Natalie, prettier than her, and came from a better family background. Her father, Richard, was Julian's former superior, the very superior who had just retired. Therefore, in her plan, Natalie's divorce was only the first step. The second step was for her to take Natalie's place. The person who would become the military wife would be her, Stephanie. Only this step, she wanted to step into the role honorably and legitimately. In her past life, Natalie had only heard a few fragmented sentences about these things right before she died. In this life, she no longer cared. If Stephanie wanted Julian, she could have him. Natalie didn't need him anymore. But fate loved to play jokes. During her 8th month working at the First State General Hospital, an incident occurred. It was a Saturday. She had just stepped down from a surgery and was eating a boxed lunch in the on-call room when Nurse Tara ran in, her face completely pale. "Dr. Natalie, the emergency room just brought in a commanding officer, and his condition is critical. It's a penetrating gunshot wound to the abdomen, causing hemorrhagic shock." Natalie put down her chopsticks and stood up. "Where is he?" "They've already pushed him into the operating room." Nurse Tara's voice trembled. "But Director Henderson is attending a seminar in the Capitol, and Dr. Wright is away for advanced training. Today, you are the only one in the department who can operate." "I understand." Natalie quickly headed toward the operating room, asking as she walked, "Where is the patient's information?" Nurse Tara handed her a piece of paper. Natalie glanced at it, and her footsteps faltered. Patient name Richard. Gender male. Age 62. Status retired commanding officer. Notes: accidental firearm discharge. Richard, Stephanie's father, Julian Austin's former superior. This thing called fate was truly ironic to the extreme. Natalie stood in front of the operating room doors for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, her mind spun rapidly. If she didn't save him, no one would say anything. She was the only one in the department, and her abilities were supposedly limited. A severely injured patient failing to pull through. In times of conflict, that was an all-too-common occurrence. But if she saved him, Stephanie's father would owe her his life. She pushed open the operating room doors and walked in. This surgery was the most difficult one she had performed in this life. The bullet had pierced through Richard's right abdomen, shattering the right lobe of his liver and grazing his right renal artery. His abdominal cavity was filled with blood. In an era with such primitive equipment, this kind of injury had a mortality rate of over 90%. But she did not back down. 30 years of medical accumulation from her past life, coupled with Professor Harding's devoted teaching in this life, plus these hands favored by innate talent, she had everything she needed. 3.5 hours later, Richard's vital signs finally stabilized. When Natalie stepped out of the operating room, her entire body was drenched in sweat, and her surgical gown was covered in blood. The hallway was crowded with people in military uniforms and civilian clothes, alongside several pale-faced guards. A middle-aged man wearing glasses rushed over. She recognized him as Director Lewis from the Military Health Department. "How did the surgery go?" "It was a success. The bullet has been removed, the liver has been repaired, and the renal artery has been reconnected." Her voice was remarkably calm. "He will need close monitoring post-operation, but for now, his vital signs are stable." Director Lewis froze for a moment, then turned his head to the people behind him. "The surgery was a success. The old commander is saved." A collective sigh of relief erupted in the hallway. Some clapped, some let out long exhales, and some turned away to wipe their tears. Then, from the back of the crowd, a figure stepped forward. His military uniform was crisp, his insignia gleaming, and his tall, sturdy posture was unshakable. That face was all too familiar to her, a jawline sharp as a sculpted knife, deep-set eyes, and thin lips pressed tightly together. Julian Austin. He was 30 years old, younger than any moment in the memories of her past life, and yet much more foreign. The moment he looked toward her, there was clear shock in his eyes. He hadn't expected that the person standing in front of the operating room doors, covered in blood, who had just saved his former superior's life, would be his newly divorced ex-wife, Natalie. "Natalie," he called her name, his voice carrying a strange, choked sound. She looked at him. Her heart didn't race, and she felt no bitterness or grievance. The feeling from her past life, wanting to cry every time she saw him, was completely gone. She felt nothing at all. It was clean and empty. "Commander Austin," she nodded politely, then turned and walked away. Behind her, she could feel his gaze following her for a very, very long time. Richard's post-operative recovery went exceptionally well. A week later, he was able to sit up on his own and eat porridge. That day, she went to do ward rounds. He was leaning against the headboard, and someone was sitting next to him. Stephanie. She was wearing civilian clothes, her hair tied in a ponytail, peeling an apple for her father. Seeing Natalie walk in, the apple peel snapped. Her hands were clearly trembling. Dr. Natalie?" She called her Dr. Natalie, no longer acting overly familiar. Natalie held the medical chart and began checking Richard's drainage tube and surgical incision. Richard looked at her, his eyes carrying complex emotions. "Dr. Natalie, you saved this old life of mine. I, Richard, will remember this favor for the rest of my life." "You're too polite, Commander. This is my duty." "No." He shook his head, his voice very solemn. "If you hadn't stepped up to the operating table that day, I would be gone. I heard from Director Lewis. You performed the surgery alone for 3.5 hours, and no one assisted you throughout the entire process." He looked straight into her eyes. "Your skills have already surpassed many surgeons who have worked their entire lives." She didn't reply and continued writing her ward round notes. Sitting next to him, Stephanie's face was terrifyingly pale. Her lips moved, but she couldn't say a word. She probably hadn't expected this scene even in her wildest dreams. She had exhausted her schemes to push Natalie away from Julian Austin, thinking she would live a miserable life. As a result, not only did Natalie not collapse, but she also became the savior of Stephanie's father. That feeling, just by looking at her face, Natalie knew exactly how agonizing it was for her. After finishing the ward rounds, Natalie turned to head out the door, and Stephanie chased after her. "Dr. Natalie," she called out to stop her. It was just the two of them in the hallway. Stephanie took a deep breath, then did something Natalie hadn't expected. She bowed. "Thank you for saving my father." Her voice trembled. Natalie looked at the top of her bowed head, her heart terrifyingly calm. In her past life, this woman had destroyed her marriage, destroyed her life. In this life, her father's life had rested in her hands, but she still saved him, not out of pure kindness, but because she was a doctor. "No need to thank me." After saying that, she turned and walked away. After taking 5 steps, she heard a very soft sob coming from behind. Stephanie was crying. Natalie didn't know why she was crying, nor did she want to know. Not long after Richard was discharged from the hospital, a rumor spread throughout the military medical circles in the state capital. A young female doctor at the 1st State General Hospital acted as the primary surgeon alone and saved Commander Richard's life. "I heard she is only 26 years old. Is that true?" A 26-year-old performing liver suturing and a renal artery anastomosis. "It's true." Luke Henderson said it himself. He reviewed the surgical records and said her suturing technique was even cleaner than his. For a time, requests for medical consultations came to her more frequently. The hospital affiliated with the State Medical Academy, the Military General Hospital, and even a few local hospitals outside the state capital began specifically asking for her by name. Director Henderson was thrilled. He patted her on the shoulder and said, "Natalie, Out of all the people I've ever mentored, you make me the proudest. She replied, Director, please stop patting, my shoulder hurts. He laughed out loud. Days passed just like that. Busy, fulfilling, and full of hope. Until the spring of 1980. A letter was sent to her dorm room. There was no return address on the envelope, but she recognized the handwriting. Square and rigid, every stroke carried the sharp edge of a soldier. It was Julian Austin's handwriting. She held the envelope, looked at it for a few seconds, and then opened it. Inside, there was only a single piece of paper with one line written on it. Natalie, I'm back in the capital. Can we meet just once? She folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, then opened a drawer and tossed it in along with some other miscellaneous items. She didn't reply. 3 days later, Julian Austin appeared at the gates of the First State General Hospital. When she walked out of the inpatient building, he was leaning against the concrete pillar by the door. He was still in the same military uniform, but he was much thinner. 2 years of duty at the border had made his facial features even sharper and colder, and his eyes were more sunken. When he saw her, he took 2 steps forward. Natalie. She stood on the steps, holding a surgical plan she had just finished writing. Commander Austin, is there something you need? He choked at her choice of address. He was silent for a few seconds before saying, I want to talk to you. Talk about what? About us. She looked down at her watch. I have a consultation in 20 minutes. Make it quick. Julian's expression shifted. Perhaps he had never been treated like this by anyone before. A dignified military region commander, yet in front of a woman, even his time to speak was limited. But he held back his temper. Natalie, the divorce back then was arranged by the organization. You don't need to explain. I know, but I signed the agreement voluntarily. You don't need to feel guilty either. She interrupted him twice, and each time his brows furrowed deeper. Natalie, can you let me finish? His voice rose slightly. She looked up at him. 30-year-old Julian Austin was handsome and imposing, exuding the aura of someone standing at the very top. In her past life, just standing in front of him would make her palms sweat. She would lower her eyes submissively, as obedient as a little rabbit. But that was her past life. Fine, speak, she said. He took a deep breath. That divorce, I investigated it later. It wasn't entirely the organization's idea. Someone interfered behind the scenes. Her heart skipped half a beat, but her face showed absolutely no change. Who? Stephanie. When he said this name, his voice was very low, carrying suppressed anger. She used her father's connections to submit a document to the higher-ups, saying that our marital relationship would compromise the mission's security. The political department didn't know the full story, so they approved it. She looked at him. So what? So, I've dealt with this matter. Stephanie has been transferred away from my side to logistics. He looked directly into her eyes. Natalie, we can remarry. Those words were so light, so incredibly light, that they made her want to laugh. In her past life, she had waited 30 years for those words. She had waited until her hair turned white, her teeth loosened, her back hunched, and her eyes blurred. She had waited until she collapsed in the kitchen. She had waited until after she died, only to hear that he had stood before her grave and said a single sentence, I owe her. In this life, he nonchalantly said they could remarry. Was that supposed to be enough? Julian Austin, did he think that was enough? There's no need, she said. Julian's entire body stiffened. What? I said, there's no need. Thank you for coming to tell me the truth, but... She looked straight into his eyes and enunciated every single word. I do not want to remarry. His expression instantly became extremely ugly. Why? Why? Because he had never truly seen her. Because in 3 years of marriage, he hadn't known what she liked to eat. Hadn't known that she had nightmares at night. And hadn't known how many tears she shed after he left. Because when he tossed the divorce agreement into his drawer, he was too lazy to even make a single phone call to ask her, Are you okay? Because in her past life, she had lived her entire life for him, while he had never lived for her for even a single day. But she didn't say a single word of this, because he wasn't worth it. There is no why, she said, looking down at her watch again. Time's up. I have to go to my consultation. As she walked past him, he suddenly reached out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was incredibly strong. He was a soldier. His arm strength was not something an ordinary person could match. But she didn't struggle. She simply looked down at the hand holding her wrist, then looked up at him. Let go. 2 words, so calm that there wasn't a single ripple of emotion. Julian met her gaze. What he saw in her eyes, she didn't know, but he let go. He slowly loosened his grip. She turned around and walked into the inpatient building. There were no footsteps chasing after her, but she knew Julian stood rooted to that spot for a very long time. After that day, he came 3 more times. The first time, he waited all night outside her on-call room. When she came out, he handed her a thermal lunchbox. "The braised pork belly you used to like the most," he said. She took it, opened it, and looked. Braised pork belly. He said it was her favorite dish, but he didn't know that she had never liked braised pork belly. She liked sweet and sour spare ribs. Braised pork belly was Valerie's favorite dish. He couldn't even tell the difference between what his wife and his mother liked to eat. She handed the lunchbox back to him. "Thank you, but I'm not hungry." The second time, he asked Director Lewis to pass her a letter. It was 3 pages long, talking extensively about how they would definitely live well together in the future. After reading it, she didn't reply. The third time, it was Valerie who came. She found her way to Natalie's dorm. When she walked in the door, her expression was incredibly ugly. "Natalie, what kind of fuss are you making? Julian already said you two can remarry. What are you playing hard to get for?" Natalie was sitting at her desk and flipping through a foreign medical journal that Professor Harding had gone through a lot of trouble to get from a colleague. "Comrade Valerie, the divorce agreement was requested by your Austen family. Now remarrying is also requested by your Austen family. Coming and going as you please. What am I, Natalie, to you? A piece of clothing that you can return whenever you're done using it?" Valerie's face turned purple. "You." Furthermore, Natalie folded the journal and looked at her. "That list in the beginning, the one that forced me to leave empty-handed, you wrote that yourself, didn't you?" Valerie's mouth instantly shut tight. $320 in savings. The sewing machine, the bicycle, the radio. You didn't even spare my mahogany dowry chests. "Comrade Valerie, you acted so heartlessly, and now you want to call me back?" Natalie stood up, walked to the door, and pulled it open. "I have nothing left to say. Please leave." Valerie stood there, her chest heaving violently, her face turning from pale to green. She opened her mouth to say something, but in the end, she couldn't say a word. When she turned to leave, her footsteps staggered. The moment the door closed, Natalie heard her curse in the hallway. "Ungrateful wretch." Natalie chuckled. In her past life, the woman had called her a country bumpkin to her face, a useless thing, mud that couldn't be plastered on a wall. The words, "ungrateful wretch," were actually the mildest insult she had ever thrown at her. 3 days after Valerie left, an unexpected person showed up. Samantha, Julian's younger sister, her former sister-in-law. In her past life, this woman had bossed her around like a free nanny for 30 years. Whenever her house lacked anything, she came to Natalie to demand it. When her son went to school, she also came to Natalie to borrow money, and once she borrowed it, she never paid it back. Natalie had helped her with countless things, yet she would turn around and tell others, "My sister-in-law, she's simple-minded, very easy to order around." In this life, she arrogantly came to Natalie's dorm, didn't knock, and pushed the door right open. "Sister-in-law, oh that's right, Natalie." She glared at Natalie sideways, hands on her hips. "You're really something, aren't you? My brother humbled himself to beg you to remarry, and you're pushing your luck?" Natalie continued flipping through her magazine without even lifting her head. "Do you know that, because of you, my brother even dealt with Stephanie? Do you know who Stephanie's father is? That's the old commander. My brother offended so many people for your sake, and look at you, playing high and mighty." The more she spoke, the angrier she got, her voice rising higher and higher. "Let me tell you, Natalie, don't be ungrateful. What is my brother's status? A dignified military region commander. So many women want to marry him but can't. You're just a lowly doctor. What right do you have to be so picky?" Natalie turned a page of the magazine. "Natalie, are you listening to me? I'm talking to you." She slammed a hand hard onto Natalie's desk. Finally, Natalie looked up at her. "Are you done talking? If you're done, then leave. The door is behind you." Samantha was trembling all over with anger, pointing a finger right at Natalie's nose. "You think you're so amazing just because you're a doctor? You're just a woman tossed aside by our Austen family. Don't even dream of remarrying in this lifetime. No one will want you." If these words had been said in her past life, she probably would have gotten red-eyed, hiding under her blanket to cry alone until morning. But in this life, she stood up, walked to the door, and pulled it open. "Samantha, in my past life, you took 12 years' worth of fabric coupons and 8 years' worth of industrial coupons from me, over $3,600. I paid your son's tuition. I advanced your mother-in-law's hospital bills. You never paid back a single cent." Samantha froze. Clearly, she didn't understand why Natalie was talking about a past life, but that didn't matter. "In this life, don't even think about getting anything from me." She looked straight into Samantha's eyes. "Get out." Samantha was frightened by her gaze. Natalie could see her pupils constrict slightly as she subconsciously took a half step back. Then, trying to maintain her bravado, Samantha scoffed, turned around, and walked away. The clack, clack, clack of her high heels against the concrete floor grew further and further away. Natalie closed the door and sat back down at her desk. Her hands were trembling slightly, not out of fear, but out of exhilaration. The feeling of finally saying the words she had suppressed for 30 years was truly too exhilarating. In the autumn of 1980, she welcomed a major turning point in her life. Professor Thomas Harding nominated her to participate in a national medical exchange event, the first national clinical skills competition for young surgeons, organized by the Department of Health. Outstanding young surgeons nominated by various states would gather in Washington, D.C. for a week of theoretical and practical examinations. She was the only female doctor nominated by her state, and also the youngest of all the contestants. On the train ride to Washington, D.C., she sat in the hard-seat carriage, watching the wilderness outside the window blur past. In her past life, she had never left the state capital her entire life. In this life, she was going to the capital of the country. The competition was held at the Central Union Hospital. In the theoretical exam, she ranked second overall. In the practical exam, she ranked first. Her total score placed her at the very top. During the award ceremony, the head of the Department of Health personally handed her the certificate. The applause from the audience roared like thunder. But what caught her attention wasn't the applause. She noticed a person sitting in the third row wearing a general's military uniform, Julian Austin. He sat there motionless, looking at her on the stage. His expression was very complex. There was shock, pride, and something hard to define, perhaps regret. She stood tall on the stage, her gaze sweeping over his head to look at the farthest wall. Hanging on that wall was a line of text. Heal the wounded, rescue the dying, practice humanitarianism. Those words held far more weight than Julian Austin's gaze. After the award ceremony, he blocked her path at the auditorium doors. This time, he didn't mention remarrying. He just looked at her in silence for a very long time before saying a single sentence. "Natalie, you are incredible." This was the first time he had praised her since they met. It had never happened in her past life. She nodded, said, "Thank you," and then picked up her luggage and walked away. From behind her came his slightly hoarse voice. "Why did you never tell me you were so outstanding?" She stopped in her tracks, turned her head to look at him, and replied, "You never asked." Upon hearing those words, Julian Austin's face instantly turned deathly pale. She turned around and left without looking back. After the competition, her name spread throughout the national medical community. The First State General Hospital made an exception and promoted her to attending physician. Director Luke Henderson personally guided her in performing a series of difficult surgeries. Professor Harding began helping her connect with opportunities to study abroad. In those days, quotas to study medicine overseas were exceedingly rare, but Professor Harding said, "With your abilities, you deserve that position." In the spring of 1981, she received an invitation letter from Heidelberg University in Germany for a 2-year clinical fellowship in cardiovascular surgery, fully funded. She held that letter and sat in her dorm room for a long time. Then she made a decision. She would go. The day before her departure, she made a trip to the military family compound. It wasn't to look for Julian, but to visit Chloe. In her past life, Chloe was her only friend in the military family compound. She was the wife of the company commander next door, 10 years older than Natalie, with a generous and warm-hearted personality. On the day Natalie died, it was Chloe who had found her collapsed in the kitchen. In this life, she wanted to come and say goodbye to her. When Chloe saw her, she tightly grasped her hands. "Natalie, you finally came. I heard you're a doctor at the First State General Hospital now, and you even won first place in a national competition." Natalie smiled and nodded. Chloe looked her up and down, her eyes turning red. "You've lost weight, but you look so much more spirited." Chloe pulled her down to sit and poured her a cup of hot water. "After you left, people in this compound talked a lot. Some said you were pitiful, some said you deserved it. But I told them, this girl Natalie will never be incompetent." She wiped her eyes. "And sure enough, you aren't." Natalie held her hand. "Chloe, I'm going abroad. I'm going to Germany to study cardiovascular surgery." "Going abroad?" Chloe froze, then burst into laughter. "That's wonderful. So wonderful. You should go out and see the world. What's so good about staying in this rundown compound anyway?" She laughed, then started to cry again. "It's just, what am I going to do when I miss you later?" Natalie's nose stung. In her past life, when she was at her lowest, Chloe had brought her meals countless times. Knowing that Valerie never treated her well, Chloe would sneak food from her own home over. "Sister, don't tell anyone. I'm not rich either, but I can't just watch you go hungry." This kindness was something she would remember across both her lives. When leaving the military family compound, she ran into someone else at the main gate, Valerie. She was just about to enter the compound, carrying a bag of vegetables. Seeing Natalie, her expression instantly darkened. "Why are you here? Didn't you say you were never coming back?" "I came to visit a friend, not to see you," Natalie said, walking past her. From behind, Valerie spoke up. "I heard you're going abroad." Natalie didn't turn around. "Good riddance. Saves us from having an eyesore around here." Her voice was neither loud nor soft, just loud enough for the guards at the gate and a few passing military wives to hear. Natalie's footsteps didn't stop, but she heard it. She heard every single word. In her past life, words like these could have made her heart ache for days. In this life, to hell with her. In the summer of 1981, she boarded a plane to Germany. It was her first time flying. Outside the window, the clouds rolled in billows, and the sun at an altitude of 10,000 meters was blindingly bright. She leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. The final image of her past life flashed through her mind. The kitchen, the half-peeled potato, her body collapsed on the cold floor. Goodbye to the Natalie who had spent her entire life revolving around the kitchen, unable to wait for her husband to return. Goodbye. 2 years later, she finished her studies and returned to her home country. What she brought back wasn't just a certificate of completion from Harvard University, but also 2 new techniques in the international field of cardiovascular surgery: hypothermic cardiopulmonary bypass, heart valve repair surgery, and minimally invasive corrective surgery for congenital heart disease in infants. At that time, these 2 techniques were almost entirely non-existent domestically. The day she returned to the First State General Hospital, Director Luke Henderson personally came to the airport to pick her up. "Natalie, you're back." He patted her shoulder. Again the shoulder. "Do you know how agonizing it has been waiting for you these past 2 years?" She smiled. "Director, could you maybe not pat my shoulder this time?" After returning, she immediately threw herself into her work. The country's first hypothermic cardiopulmonary bypass heart valve repair surgery, with her acting as the primary surgeon, was successfully completed at the First State General Hospital. The surgical process was broadcast live to 23 hospitals across the state. The operation was extremely successful. After the broadcast ended, applause from the 23 hospitals echoed back simultaneously. That day, the name Natalie spread from the state level to the entire nation. The events that followed developed faster than she had imagined. In 1984, she was specially invited by the Department of Health to be an advisory expert in the field of cardiovascular surgery. In 1985, she led and completed the country's first minimally invasive corrective surgery for congenital heart disease in infants. In 1986, she presented a paper at the International Cardiovascular Surgery Conference, receiving the highest praise from the entire assembly. At 32 years old, she became a chief physician and the youngest cardiovascular surgery expert in the country. This was the track record she had delivered 8 years after being reborn. What was she doing during those same 8 years in her past life? Oh, right. She had been planting vegetables in the courtyard of the military family compound. During that time, did anyone come looking for her to remarry? Yes. Julian Austin came a few more times, but each time her answer was the same. No. From his initial pleading, he gradually shifted into silence. In the end, he would stand at the door of her office, looking at the commendation pennants and certificates hanging on the wall, and said, "Natalie, I wasn't a good husband." That was the truest thing he had ever said in his entire life. She said, "I know." He smiled bitterly. "Do you hate me?" Hate him? She truly didn't hate him. Hating someone was too exhausting. In her past life, she had hated him for 30 years, hated him until her hair turned white and her back hunched, and finally carried that hatred all the way into her coffin. In this life, she had no spare energy to waste on hatred. Then, do I still have a chance? His voice was very low. This was the most insecure Julian Austin she had ever heard. A dignified commander standing before a woman had turned into a flustered man who didn't know what to do. But she didn't soften. The 30 years of coldness from her past life couldn't melt away just because of his single sentence. Do I still have a chance? Julian. It was the first time she called him by his first name. He suddenly looked up. You have your path, and I have mine. Our previous marriage was the biggest regret of my life, but now she looked at the sky outside the window. I have no more regrets. He stood there for a very long time. Then he turned and left. This time he didn't look back. As he walked out of the office, his back seemed to hunch momentarily. She looked at his retreating back, feeling unusually calm. In her past life, she had watched his back as he walked away for 30 years. In this life, This would be the last time. Years later, in 1990, Julian Austin requested a transfer from the front lines to the rear. She heard that he lived alone in the military compound, raising a dog. Every day when he walked the dog, he would stand for a while under the pomegranate tree near the family compound. That pomegranate tree was the one they had planted the year they got married. Later on, Stephanie married a regimental commander in logistics. Her life was neither good nor bad, and she never came looking for Natalie again. As Valerie grew older, her health was constantly poor. Once, she was hospitalized, coincidentally at the First State General Hospital. The nurses came to ask Natalie for a consultation, and she went. Pushing open the door to the ward, she saw the white-haired old woman lying on the bed. When Valerie saw her, her lips trembled for a long time before she finally said, "Natalie, you came." "Comrade Valerie, I came to look at your scans." She held up Valerie's CT scan against the light to examine it. From start to finish, she didn't mention a single thing about the past. Just as she was about to leave, the woman called out from behind, "Natalie." She called her Natalie, no longer calling her by her full, formal name. "What I did back then, I was wrong." Natalie stood with her back to her, her hand on the doorknob. "I know." After saying that, she stepped out. The door closed very gently behind her. The hallway was quiet. She stood there for a few seconds, took a deep breath, and walked toward the next ward. She still had many patients to see. In the year 2020, Natalie was 66 years old. At the National Cardiovascular Surgery Lifetime Achievement Award ceremony, she stood on the stage, looking out at the massive crowd below. The host read her biography. Professor Natalie, the pioneer of hypothermic cardiopulmonary bypass heart valve repair surgery in our country. She has led over 8,000 cardiovascular surgeries, trained 42 doctoral candidates, and published 137 international research papers. The applause from the audience went on and on without end. Standing under the spotlight, she suddenly remembered a winter from many years ago. December 16, 1978. In a ward at the military hospital, a young woman wearing a thin padded jacket had signed a divorce agreement. In her pocket, she had only $7.30. She had absolutely nothing. But she wasn't afraid of anything, because she knew that in this life, she would only live for herself.
She proved the best revenge is simply living a brilliantly successful life. True power and security come from your own skills and independence, not who you marry. What did you think of her decisive exit? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe.